Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the AABIP podcast series. This is Roger Kim from the University of Pennsylvania, Perelman School of Medicine in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm your host for this episode. Thank you all for joining us today. Today, we'll be discussing how to build a successful research career in the field of interventional pulmonology. We are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Matt Kinsey joining us today. Dr. Kinsey is the Director of Interventional Pulmonology and an assistant professor at the Larner College of Medicine at the University of Vermont. As one of the few interventional pulmonologists in the country to have ever received an NAHK award, he is a well-renowned physician scientist and was the recipient of the 2023 AABIP Jeffrey McLennan Memorial Award for Advances in Interventional Pulmonology. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Kinsey.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for the nice introduction.
First off, is it okay if I call you Matt?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, perfect. Matt, do you have any relevant conflicts of interest to disclose?
Well, I have a number of disclosures. None of them are directly related to what we're going to talk about today, but I have grant funding from the NIH and Johnson & Johnson. I consult for Johnson & Johnson in nanology, previously consulted for Olympus, and we have some grants on the translational side as well, but none of those are directly related to what we're going to discuss today.
Sounds great. As a reminder, the views expressed on this podcast are those of the speaker and mine alone, and not necessarily endorsed by the AABIP. With the formalities done, let's get started. Interventional pulmonology is still a relatively new field, but it has become more nationally well recognized as an essential clinical subspecialty. However, in order to advance the field as a whole, high-quality investigator-led research is necessary to promote innovation and ultimately improve patient care. Matt, could you tell us how you first got involved in research and how you carved out time early in your career to be able to do your work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and probably one of the critical ones. And I think it's the carving out time piece is probably critical throughout your career. So I think both early in your career and throughout. But I think we take it a step sort of at a time. I've been interested in research for a long time, and I've always enjoyed doing research. As an undergraduate, I did some work in chemical physics, and then had a couple of small grants. They're basically summer grants through the National Science Foundation, the research experience for undergraduates. And then that led to some work at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington, that I finished immediately after I graduated from college, as well as finishing the med school prereqs. And then I went to, in my fellowship, I started working, obviously, as everybody does, on your fellowship research projects, and was working in lung cancer epidemiology with Dr. David Christiani at the Harvard School of Public Health. And in quantitative image analytics, it was kind of a combined project with Drs. George Washko and Raul San Jose Estepar at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And so that was really the genesis, I think, of the current research career. And I realized, I think critically at that point, that clinical science was truly was a science, and that I needed to get additional training if I wanted to be somebody that was going to design and run clinical trials. I think that's probably one of the better decisions I made. And so then I finished eventually a MPH at the Harvard School of Public Health with a focus in trial design and biostatistics. That's been incredibly helpful. So I think it's always a question of how relatable or how relevant one person's experience is to anybody else. But I think the key really for anybody thinking about a career in research is, what are you interested in doing, and how do you begin to develop expertise in that area or areas? And so I think that's a really critical question. I'll stop there for a pause, I guess, or a minute, but because there's a lot there. But I think that's a place to start.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think one of the themes I'm hearing, just hearing you discuss your initial interest in research is this concept of of having your research mirror your clinical expertise and kind of having your experiences in the clinic directly inform the research that you're interested in doing. I think sometimes some of the junior folks just getting started in research have the struggle of wanting to do research and maybe having a basic science or a bench project that may not be directly translatable or directly related to, something that they might be clinically expert at doing, such as procedures and, bronchoscopy and some of the things that we do in interventional pulmonology. Can you speak a little bit more about how this training in clinical science that you referred to kind of helped you meld those two worlds together?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Roger. I think you have to, as a physician scientist, find some way to dovetail your research and your clinical interest / practice. You essentially are double dipping, right? You need to be able to make better use of your time. And so I think that can take a number of different forms. What I've done is sort of what you intimated is that I knew that, we wanted to study intratumoral therapy for lung cancer. And so as we moved into that field, said, okay, how do we leverage the ability to do trials and then take tissue and image data from those studies and then use that to inform subsequent designs of our clinical trials and the subsequent hypotheses we want to test. And so by laying that out, it allowed us to really develop, a cycle, if you will, a flywheel that feeds on itself a little bit and allows us both from a time standpoint, and by us, I mean myself, our research scientists, our fellows who work with us, all the people involved, to enroll patients that they're seeing in clinic, to use those data that they understand and, like image data, CT data. Most interventional pulmonologists are recognized as experts in bronchoscopy, but actually are also experts in image analytics, at least at a subjective level, right? Because we stare at CT scans all the time. And, all due respect to our radiology colleagues, we see things sometimes that they don't. I think everybody has had that experience. And I think that's just has to do with our training and the number of CTs that we see of a specific sort of form. Oh, these are patients who are being referred for valves. We look at emphysema all the time. Oh, these are patients that are referred for a suspicious lung lesion. Oh, we look at lung nodules all the time, to hearken to your practice. So I think that, leveraging that expertise or those expertise, and then our ability to see those patients, get those data, acquire tissues, that has all been really important for me personally and professionally to be able to maintain a research career. But I think that, it doesn't have to take that form. And I think if you do basic research and you study alpha-1 antitrypsin, on the laboratory side, you could, get lung tissue specimens. You could look at, genotype tests in the patients that you see. There's a number of ways that you could, for instance, dovetail those things together. But I do think it is important because, we bring a unique set of skills to bear on this problem, and you have to find a way to actually leverage that.
I think that's so important. Just making sure that we highlight our unique skill set, both clinically and, at times research-wise, because of our ability to understand where some of the maybe the biggest questions that need to be answered are in the scientific space, which directly informs clinical practice, is just so important. And I think that actually dovetails nicely into another question that I had for you, which is, about the actual practical aspects of how to go about doing research. So as we all know, time is incredibly precious. We're all super busy. We're getting pulled in a million directions at once, especially with our, clinical expertise and workload. And as such, grant funding is incredibly important in order to try to carve out some dedicated time to be able to do research. What tips do you have for our listeners regarding, how to secure grant funding and ultimately how to, get the protected time necessary to do research and to build a research team?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Roger. Let me make one more comment to you previously on what we were talking about. Just one thing I think that's worth expounding. I think it's very well recognized that, doing research as a physician scientist, and particularly as a proceduralist, can be incredibly difficult. But I think one of the things that we don't always acknowledge is the really amazing opportunity that you have in that space. Just as you were saying, if we can leverage those skills and that experience and that access to patients, we have just there are so many PhDs that come and say, hey, can you get us tissue for this? Hey, we don't have access to any human data. And so I think we have a really, really nice opportunity within the field of interventional pulmonary. It certainly is challenging for all the reasons that you've stated and have been well highlighted before. To get to your current question, I think there's a number of things. I think first is like the most important, really the most important characteristic that you can have and to deploy, because it's really something that you use in this space, is just commitment. Right? So that's the first. And really what that takes the form of is deciding that you're going to do research and then making sure the people that you work for know that. So I think that's number one, right? And then that begins to roll into the practicalities of it. So for instance, if you're a fellow and you're talking to your let's start at the general pulmonary fellow level. Okay, so you're a general pulmonary fellow and you're talking to your program director. Okay, listen, I'm interested in interventional pulmonary and research, and I eventually want to have a research career. You know what? That's good for the general pulmonary program if you go on to do research. They want you to do that. Like that reflects well on that training program. So, okay, what does that look like? Well, maybe you go on to a training grant, a T32, an institutional training grant. If you're at an institution that doesn't have a training grant, and even if you are one actually that does, one thing that can be really nice is to write an F32, which is an NIH grant, that funds your training. And it's basically designed to create a unique physician scientist. And those can be really incredible grants because they're scored not only on the research, but on your mentorship plan and your training plan and how you're going to develop your career. So those can be extremely helpful, both to sort of line out what your career is going to look like or what it potentially is going to look like. It never follows the track exactly as you lay out, but they can also provide a lot of funding, and they're not overly competitive. I mean, they're competitive, but they are imminently obtainable, and that is a huge jumping off. Sometimes there's an additional year of training that you need to do 2 years. So if you do one on the F, you have to do another one. And that can be worked out with the interventional pulmonary program. So a lot of interventional pulmonary programs require 2 years now. Many of the big academic programs, a year of research and a year of clinical training. Okay, cool. If you walk in with your own F32, because that's a transferable grant, then okay, you've already got a leg up. You've brought your own set of funding, a dedicated project, all those kind of things. There are also these F99s, which are a way to initially get some funding as a pulmonary fellow, but then you go into more of what would be considered a postdoc setting. That could also be applied to your training. And a lot of these things can be sorted out if you have conversations with the program officer in the NIH that is associated with that grant. And then there are obviously a number of institutional or private foundation grants that are available as well. And so there's a lot of opportunities in the training grant world, and I think sometimes people don't realize how flexible they are, which I think is the point to get across in this podcast is that you read these things and you say, I have no idea how this could fit with interventional pulmonary. But these funding organizations, be it the NIH or private foundation, et cetera, they want to develop unique physician scientists. And so they're built to be flexible around these things. And so it's always worth a conversation, and to reach out, call the NIH program officer. Hey, I'm not sure if I'm eligible for this. Here's what I'm thinking about doing. And they'll say, yes, you are. Maybe no, you're not, but, apply anyway, and then we'll figure it out afterwards. Or, hey, look at this other mechanism. So those are always good conversations to have. So definitely use those resources if it's something that you're interested in. So I think that's a good place to kind of think about it. And then, as you look at positions at jobs, I interviewed for 4 or 5 different positions when I was coming out of fellowship. And in all of those, I said, hey, I want some protected research time. And most institutions, if you're serious about it and have sort of a demonstrated history, meaning you've applied for grants and or you've published a paper or two, really in anything, even if it's not the focused field that you eventually want to end up in, then a lot of times, additional protected time and or funding for a research coordinator and or some small number of dollars as a startup package are typically available. So don't be afraid to ask for those things. And I think you can commonly also turn positions that are, hey, this is a clinical science track or a clinician educator track, or the tracks have various different monikers, but whether you're on a research track, an education track, or a clinician scholar track, if you will, right? There's commonly flexibility around all of those. So again, I think there's a little bit more flexibility in the system than we sometimes see at first blush. So having the conversation and declaring that you're interested in research and you're looking for ways to do that can be sometimes the most powerful thing you can start out with.
I really love that advice. Stating up front what your goals are, and then having that commitment to kind of follow through and get the grants or apply for the grants. I think it's just so incredibly important. I guess I'll also share that one of the things I learned along the way was to carefully read those RFAs, those requests for applications, just to know what those funds that you're applying for might be used for. Not all grants out there, especially some of the smaller ones, will allow you to cover part of your salary, which will, by definition, not protect your time if that's one of those things that you've negotiated within your contract. Whereas others, will allow you to use some of those funds to actually, cover your salary, in addition to, of course, providing some funds for the research itself. So I guess not to get too much into the weeds, but I think just probably important to highlight just to read those RFAs very carefully and to also make sure that it kind of fits within your job description for the job that you have applied for or that you are currently at. Because if you're hired for to cover 90% clinical position, it may not be feasible to be able to do research after the fact if you've been hired for a mainly clinical position.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Always looking at how you can fund effort and time is really important. And I think it's also worth saying that, you can ask for, in thinking about, sort of out of the box ways to fund effort in the research realm, even on industry funded clinical trials, not investigator initiated. These are industry sponsored studies that are developed by industry partners. If you can justify the need for some coverage of your effort, you should always look at doing that. They'll commonly pay on a capitated participant rate, meaning if you enroll patients, your center gets X number of dollars, and it flows down from there depending on what the various research procedures are and steps, visits, et cetera, that need to take place. But you can, in some of those, also say, hey, the site PI needs some protected time. I need, 5% effort, right? 2 hours a week for taking care of the regulatory stuff, the various interactions with the IRB, the data safety monitoring, whatever those requirements are within that for that particular study. So those are also ways that sometimes you can get some protected effort for your research, right? That even is beyond the investigator-initiated NIH track, but it allows you to sort of build.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for walking us through, the various different mechanisms for being able to, get that funding to do research. So that kind of dovetails nicely into another question I had for you, Matt, which is that, of course, interventional pulmonology is a procedural subspecialty, and it's really important for us to be able to maintain our skills, especially the further number of years we get out from training. And in addition to being a successful scientist, you've been able to establish, the first interventional pulmonary program at UVM and remain, of course, very clinically active. How have you balanced your research with your clinical responsibilities?
Yeah, that's always a challenge. I mean, we've talked a little bit about leveraging your clinical time to also benefit the research, and I think that's obviously critically important. I think there's a number of, it's a challenging question actually is what you're hearing a little bit of that. I don't know if there's an easy answer. It's something that you always are sort of, weighing. What are the balances? What's the next thing that needs to happen? What's that? I used to have this paradigm where I would say, okay, we're going to work on, for the next couple of months, I'm going to work on program development in this area. Like, okay, we need to stand up an endobronchial valve for lung volume reduction program. Okay, we got to do a bunch of education on the floors, where these patients are going to be admitted. We got to do some education for the OR staff around what this is going to look like and all the things that go into that. We need to bring on the nurse to help manage the program, all things like that. And then, then I'd say, okay, next couple months, I'm going to work on writing more grants and kind of pushing the research up, whatever. Anymore, it feels like it oscillates more quickly than that. So it can always be a little bit of a balancing act. I think again, part of it is commitment, and that you have to be willing to, nobody wants to hear this, but you have to be willing to say no to some other things, right? So I've been, pretty clear as I've continued to have research funding that, I don't practice critical care unless it's, in the midst of a pandemic, right? But unless it's an all hands on deck sort of situation. I say no to teaching opportunities that some people would certainly be enthusiastic about, and and at some point in my career I may as well. But I think you can't be sort of everything to everybody, and so you have to make some decisions within that. I think that's for your own happiness in the end. To be honest with you, I think the people that quite frankly can't say no end up being pulled in a lot of directions and really, pretty unhappy. I think there's a good book. I don't know if we're allowed to recommend books on the AABIP.
Oh, please do.
I have no financial interest in the book, but there's a book that I like entitled Essentialism. Greg McNown, I think, is the author, which is a nice kind of lays out that idea and starts with a problem that I think we see commonly in medicine, which is that you can be busy all day and then get home and sometimes not feel like you've moved the needle on the things that you really wanted to do that day. And you were legitimately busy. You were answering all the emails, doing all the things, whatever. And then you get home and you go, man, I didn't get that whatever it was you cared about. And I didn't get that paper written today. I was going to read a little bit more about rare manifestations of IgG4 related disease, and that didn't get done. Or, like things that you feel like you want to do that make your career worthwhile and why you went to all of those years of school. So I think that's part of it. You got to be willing to to say no to some things, and I think you have to be a little bit disciplined with your time and be really clear that, that these are times I'm at work, I'm doing these things, and try to be disciplined about it.
That's such great advice, Matt. And I know you and I have talked offline about this exact concept, and I'm just so glad that you're able to share in such an eloquent way, that concept of trying to find that balance. And, I think just to add to that, I think a lot of folks, obviously everyone's working on work-life balance, and what that means to different people, is different. But, I personally think that just thinking about all these different concepts that we've discussed today, like setting aside time for like actual numeric percentages of effort to do certain things research wise or administratively, is just so important, and also helps carve out some kind of time to do the things that you want to do, which, as you mentioned, will potentially help with work-life balance. And frankly, I think a lot of people end up going into research-heavy careers because of work-life balance issues. Not everybody, of course, and you have to be loving what you're doing. But I think just that concept of being very cognizant of what you're doing with your time is just so incredibly important, especially for us early career folks like myself. Being pulled in a million directions, like you said, is just a very real thing. And I think it's just important to kind of maintain the kind of guiding North Star, like you mentioned.
The other thing I'd say on that, Roger, that this is going to bend a little bit into the philosophical here, but I think fundamentally a lot of people get into medicine because they are intrinsically motivated people, right? And you want to feel like you are doing something that is valuable for patients and for other people. And so I think one of the challenges we can get into is when things are really harried and you're running around all the time, you can get to the point where you don't feel like you're actually doing that or you're accomplishing that at the level that you want to. And I think that can be really challenging for us as physicians in general, and certainly as physician scientists. And so I think, that's the value of saying no, is it actually can make you a much sort of happier provider, if you will, right? A much happier person, because it allows you to focus on the things that you find rewarding in your career.
Absolutely. That's such great advice, Matt. I don't want to keep you for too long. I know I've already kept you for about 30 minutes. So at this point, I'm wondering if you have any closing remarks or any other kind of pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners.
I think just a couple of things, and I think it actually relates to that commitment piece. I think the crux to that is really that you have to find a problem you care about. So don't choose a problem based on what is the hottest thing at that time in the field, or that somebody else thinks is really interesting and is fired up about, or that even necessarily your mentor or mentors might think is really the problem. You got to find one that you really care about and that you're really interested in. And then you got to find work that you like doing. Right? If you really don't like pipetting, it doesn't matter how interesting the problem is in the end, right? Because you got to enjoy that work. So you got to find something about that work that you like doing, right? And those are the things that allow you, I think, to stay committed in research. I think sometimes people choose based on what they think is going to get funded. Right? And actually, I think that's the wrong way to do it. I think choose the problem you care about, and then it'll sort of become clear how you get funded through that. What is the sub-problem? What is the hypothesis that you're going to test? What are all the things that flow from that? And so I think, and if you think back on it, really, like the NIH, these funding, they want to make a unique physician scientist. And so they don't actually want you to be a carbon copy of your mentor or whatever the expertise is at your institution or at your training program. So I think those are really important points. I see people kind of go down that road, and I've gone down this road, and this is sort of like burned hand teaches best stuff. Like I've made these mistakes, and And so I think that's a really critical piece is work on something that, that you're fired up about, that you wake up in the morning and go, this is interesting. This is worth spending some cycles on. So I'll stop there, but I think that's important.
Thank you so much again for your time today, Matt. Those were really inspiring words, and I know I personally learned a lot from you just now, and I'm confident that our listeners will as well. So thank you so much again for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Great discussion.